What's going on, guys? My name is PJ. Welcome to my channel and thank you for choosing to watch this video. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite books of all time. One of the big reasons why this channel even exists in the first place, why I am sitting here in front of this camera being able to shoot this video and overcome what Steven Pressfield in the world of art would call resistance. So I'm going to talk about a book that truly has changed my life. And by definition of changing my life, I literally mean my life looked one way before reading this book, and it looks completely different after reading this book. And there are only a few books that I can truly say that about. Not that many books come into your life and truly change your life. Books that take your life from point A to point B and truly transform your life from inside out. This book, without a shadow of a doubt, was one of those books and still is one of the books that changes my life throughout the years. It's one of those books that grows with you and changes with you and becomes more and more profound as time goes on and as you begin exercising the things that it talks about. The book that we're going to talk about, as I mentioned briefly earlier, is The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. What is The War of Art and who is Steven Pressfield? Steven Pressfield is an author who has written many books and screenplays, books that turned into screenplays rather. One of the most famous ones is called The Legend of Bagger Vance, which is also a movie by the same title. Another one of his fictional books called Gates of Fire. Another one is called Man at Arms. Another one is called Tides of War. I believe those are some of his more well-known ones. These are his fictional books. And he is also really and mainly known, I feel like, more so personally, I feel like he's more known for his non-fiction books, such as the book that we're talking about today, The War of Art, but also other books like Turning Pro, Do the Work, The Authentic Swing, The Warrior Ethos. Another one is The Artist's Journey, which is one of my favorite ones. It's basically a play on the hero's journey by Joseph Campbell. He's applying similar concepts to that to specifically artists and creatives, anyone that's really trying to do anything creatively, whether it be creating art literally or creating a business, creating an upward movement in their lives per se. And that's one of my favorite nonfiction books by his as well. But The War of Art is the quintessential book of his, especially out of his nonfiction books. It's kind of the nonfiction book of his that started his journey of writing more nonfiction books. And it became basically the beginning of a series that I think the second book of is Turning Pro, and then Do the Work, I think, is the third one in that series. But nonetheless, The War of Art is a very profound book. It's a very short book, and The War of Art itself is all about overcoming creative blocks, creative obstacles, and it doesn't just apply to art, literally. It applies to any form of self-improvement. And it's why I titled this video a book that anyone who is trying to achieve something or improve themselves, should read. And it's this book because even though the title says The War of Art, it really is, in a sense, the war of self-improvement, the war of self-betterment, and becoming a more higher version of yourself, or rather becoming the true version of yourself beyond all the false identities that we all have. The War of Art consists of 3 books, or 3 main parts, but Steven Pressfield calls them books within The War of Art. Book 1 of The War of Art, the first section of The War of Art, Steven Pressfield spends that time defining the enemy that we're facing anytime we're trying to make any sort of upward mobility in our lives, any sort of self-improvement, any sort of creative endeavor. And the enemy that he identifies, he calls it the resistance. We'll talk about the resistance in a lot more detail shortly after this introduction. The book 2 of The War of Art is called, basically, it's the antidote to the resistance. So enemy is what's identified in the first part, and then the antidote, or how we can overcome that enemy, the internal enemy of resistance, that's what is answered in part 2 of The War of Art. And the antidote to overcoming resistance is what Steven Pressfield calls becoming a professional, or turning pro rather. And then the third part of this book is called The Muse, or it's all about basically invoking the muse, or rather, to put it more plainly, is inviting inspiration. Because, one of the things that Steven Pressfield talks about a lot is that a true artist, a true professional, doesn't always wait for inspiration in order to start their work, but rather they kind of like, obviously they always invite and welcome inspiration when it does show up, the muse, when it does show up, and they try to do as much preparation work for the muse to show up, the invocation of the muse basically, or the inspiration, but they don't always rely on it. But he talks about how even though a professional doesn't rely on it, how much we all need it and benefit from inspiration, the muse as he calls it. So we're going to jump in and talk about book one, or the main bulk of this whole War of Art kind of ethos, which is the resistance. What is the resistance? What is this internal enemy that Steven Pressfield has helped us all identify? And that is honestly the biggest contribution that he has made in the War of Art. I feel like, because a lot of us undertake any sort of self-improvement or creative endeavor or starting a business or anything that's an upward mobility in our lives without having first identified the enemy in our way. And when we don't know we are in this battle, we are definitely going to lose, because we don't even know we're in a war when we are. And so the enemy kind of has the upper hand. But what Steven Pressfield has so beautifully done in the War of Art is that he has identified the enemy. He has named it. He has called it something, and now it was always real, but now it's more tangible, and we can face it, approach it, and learn how to overcome it. So let's talk about book one of the War of Art and talk about the resistance, what it is, and what forms it takes in our lives. Okay, so now what is resistance? This is the topic of book one of the War of Art. Resistance is what basically stands between where you are and where you want to go. So if this is where you are and you're trying to grow to here, basically move from one level of being to a higher level of existence. And Steven Pressfield talks about how resistance only operates when you're trying to go from a lower state of being to a higher, when you're aspiring, so to speak, to a higher state of being, whether it's to grow in some area of your life, to improve in some shape or form, to start a business, to create art, to whatever it is, that's an improvement. He says like resistance never comes into play if you're here and you're trying to do something that's lower, it's like a lower level. He says like if you're basically trying to start a spam calling, phone business, you're not going to encounter resistance because there's no upward mobility. You're not trying to improve. That's like a downward mobility. And when you're going downward, resistance doesn't show up. So resistance always is what stands between you and upward mobility from where you are and where you want to be. That's where resistance stands. And over the years, I think the War of Art came out in 2002. So literally it's been like 20 years, 21 years now since the War of Art has been released. And throughout the podcast that Steven Pressfield has been doing in the recent years, he's really elaborated more on his understandings now in the course of the 20 years that he's been talking about resistance publicly, his understandings as to what resistance is. And I have come to believe and experience that in my own life, basically what he recently talks about in recent podcasts as to what resistance is. And that's actually how it's been kind of revealed itself to me as well over the recent years that I've been working with the concepts in this book. So resistance, as I see it and as Steven Pressfield sees it now, is, and this is going to kind of go a little bit deeper, and it's more, I feel like this is deeper kind of understanding of resistance than what is mentioned in the War of Art. But I believe, and Steven Pressfield has come to believe, that resistance in a sense is like a defense mechanism of the ego. The ego is our sense of who we are, who we think we are, who we say we are, right? We think like, I'm person A, I'm only capable of this much, and I've only accomplished this much, and all those stories, right? That's like our sense of identity, our ego. And our ego, just like any other kind of creature, any sort of other being, it seeks survival. It wants to maintain, so it wants to survive, and it wants to maintain a sense of control. It wants to stay, it wants things to stay the same. And our ego is very much afraid of growth and change because it likes familiarity. It doesn't like to change. It doesn't like to grow. It likes things to stay the same because that gives it a sense of control. And when we are aspiring to change and become better in some area of our lives, or start a business, or make art, or do anything that's upward mobility, that is very threatening to the foundation and the structure of the ego. So the ego starts freaking out and starts recruiting these allies to basically maintain its position on our identity. It's like, no, you are who ego says this, you are who I say you are, not who you think or want to become. So basically it's trying to prevent us from becoming and remaining who we are. It wants to prevent that upward mobility. And in doing so, it recruits a lot of allies. And we talk about how this resistance is basically the resistance of the ego. And this is a much, much deeper look at resistance. This is something that I have come to believe and understand over the course of the past 5 years that I've been working with the concepts in this book, is that the resistance really is the resistance of the ego to change. That's what resistance is at its core. So the way Steven Pressfield talks about it too is that it's a very real force. It's like an evil force trying to stop you. But like I said, when you dive more deeply into it, it is what I just said. It's the resistance of the ego to change. And in doing so, the ego will recruit a lot of allies to stop you from changing. And we're going to talk about some of those allies. These are some of the different forms that resistance takes. These are some of the allies that our ego recruits to maintain its position on your being, on your sense of who we are. Anytime you're trying to challenge the ego and you say, I'm not who I think I am anymore, I am aspiring to become something else, something better, move upward. For example, if you've never created some sort of art per se, and you don't see yourself as a creative person, as a person who is able to do such a thing, your ego has been formed to believe that as the reality of who you are. Now to challenge it and start developing a certain skill set to create art, to produce something such as art, but it could be also starting a business. Like your ego may be like, you've never started a business. You're not the type of person that can start a business. You've never done it before. You don't know how to do it. You can't do it. The ego is an amalgamation of stories about who it thinks you are, who you think you are really. But anytime you're trying to challenge that, let's say start a business, create art, and you are now saying, my ego may not at this current reality believe that I can be an artist, but I believe something bigger than the ego, the self with the capital S, the truest essence of who we are, our spirit, is way more capable and sees us as way more capable than what the ego sees us as being capable of. So anytime you're trying to challenge that and say, I'm going to be an artist, I'm going to cultivate the skill sets required to produce art, let's say, I'm going to work on that craft, my craft, any craft that you may be interested in. Or I'm going to start the business. I am going to lose weight. I am going to get out of this lower state that I'm in and move upward, change my life, improve my life in some shape or form. The ego will will fight tooth and nail and try to survive as much as it can, and will recruit allies. The resistance of the ego to change will recruit allies, but you are deciding that you are gonna choose a new identity. You are changing your identity, and you can see how this is super challenging to the old identity, because in order for the new identity to be born, the old identity has to fall away. And a good book really that talks about this even more deeply from a different perspective is called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, which I think is such a great title. And it goes to the heart of what we're talking about here. Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself is by Joe Dispenza. And it talks about how the person who we think we are has become a habit. And these habits are kind of hard to break. Breaking the old identity is hard to break. But you can do it, but resistance is what shows up in the way of you trying to embody and become that new identity that's challenging the current identity. So let's talk about some of the different forms that resistance of our ego takes to prevent us from changing. These are some of the forms that Steven Pressfield has identified in the world of art, and we're going to briefly mention each one. Number one, resistance and procrastination. So procrastination is one form that resistance takes. Another one that Steven Pressfield has identified is sex or sexual urges. And I feel like in the modern society, probably more than ever, in any other human time, I think our society, especially in the Western world, is overly sexualized. And that is also robbing you from the attention, not everyone, but some of us, it's robbing you from the attention that you can be pouring otherwise into your creative endeavors, your self-improvement journey, and so on and so forth. So that's another form that resistance takes, and another ally that resistance recruits in trying to prevent you from changing and growing. Another form is trouble. So what Steven Pressfield is talking about here is that some people are addicted to getting in trouble, or another form is drama, which is pretty associated to this. It's like people who just cannot, it seems like they can't avoid getting in trouble, getting into drama. And these kind of things are, every time you do that, it's like you are now delaying starting that new business, delaying that new challenge that you're taking on, whether it be a creative challenge, whether it be some sort of self-improvement challenge. You are delaying that by getting into trouble, by starting drama. So that's another form that the resistance of our ego takes. It's like the ego is so afraid of change that it will literally choose to get into trouble or start drama in order to delay the change or prevent the change entirely. And if you allow it to win, then that would be a very unfortunate situation, because you could be spending your whole life having delayed your purpose, your mission, your creative endeavors. So that's another form. The trouble and drama is another form that resistance takes. Another form that resistance takes is self-victimization, seeing yourself as a victim. Now, I'm not negating that there are actual victims in the world, but self-victimization is a different concept. Is when you are believing yourself to be a helpless victim, like I am apathetic, I cannot change my situation, I cannot change, I cannot initiate and have agency, a sense of agency in my own life. That's another form that resistance takes, is when it makes you think you're a victim, a helpless victim that doesn't have any agency, doesn't have the ability to have initiative in their own lives. And that's something I've definitely fallen into myself. The years that I was delaying doing this, which is something I wanted to do for a very long time. I believe that victimization definitely was part of my chapter, part of the forms of resistance that showed up in my life. So that's another one that can be a very big hindrance. Another form that resistance takes is self-medication or narcotization. It's basically when you are, a lot of us basically self-medicate in a lot of different ways. And Steven Pressfield talks about how it's like when people start overcoming their resistance in life, it's like when you start overcoming in one area of life, you start all of a sudden these pains or ailments or these things that were causing you trouble start to fall away, because it's like they're a form of resistance. So a lot of us, we are self-medicating with different things: food, drugs, alcohol, whatever it may be, distractions, TikTok, this, that, and 100 other things. And we're self-medicating and narcotizing ourselves, in a sense, into a slumber, so to speak. And that is a form of resistance. And when you start overcoming the resistance, all of a sudden the desire to self-medicate, to numb yourself, goes away, because that desire to be numb is, in a sense, is the unlived life, which is another term that Steven Pressfield uses in the world of art. The unlived life, the untapped potential. It's like, it's there. It wants to be expressed. That unlived life, when you are not expressing it, is painful, but we don't even realize that that's what's causing us this pain. So we're numbing ourselves to the subtle, unconscious, unable to express pain of our unlived life. And that is a form that resistance takes. This self-medication is a form that resistance takes, again, to delay us living and actualizing that potential of that unlived life. So self-medication is another form that resistance takes. Another form that resistance can take in your life is unhappiness or depression, and again, not negating real depression, not negating that people, all of us go through times and chapters and seasons. I know I certainly have, especially this last year, where you feel just very down. You feel very depressed, you feel very unhappy. And in those times, it's like the resistance can be so strong because like literally the thing that could help you is taking action, is initiating some sort of change, aspiring for upward mobility, or aspiring for a better story. Another really, really, really great book that can go very, very well with the world of art is called Hero on a Mission by Donald Miller, which is a book that really helped me also in the past year. And he talks about aspiring for a better story. It's like we're writing the story of our lives, but a lot of us have stopped writing it. We have no interesting story that we're chasing or pursuing. And that in and of itself can be a very big antidote to unhappiness, to depression. But that depression, being a form of resistance, is stopping you from doing that, from doing actually what's going to help you. So that's the unhappiness and depression is another form that resistance can take. But overcoming that and deciding to still go for your goals, for your dreams, for your artistic endeavors, for your entrepreneurial aspirations, for your fitness aspirations, whatever it may be, any sort of self-improvement, that may be the antidote. Overcoming that resistance, that unhappiness, which is a form of resistance, overcoming that can help you actually overcome the unhappiness as well, and kind of kick the depression, so to speak, by taking action and aspiring for that upward mobility or aspiring to write a better story. Another form that resistance can take in your life is self-doubt. That's pretty much self-explanatory. It's like when you are just completely not believing in yourself. And again, like the ego may be so formed as like the identity of you being someone who doesn't believe in themselves being able to do a certain thing. So self-doubt is definitely a form of resistance. Another one is fear, and at the core of it, resistance is fear. Is the fear of the ego, is the fear of the old identity that you're trying to break out of. You're trying to break the habit of being yourself. It's that old identity that you're trying to break out of. That fear is the core of what resistance is in a lot of ways. And fear, just being scared of success, being scared of failure, being scared of what people may think, being scared of all those things, that fear is also a form of resistance. It's like that fear could delay you pursuing your dreams and goals and going for that upward mobility in life for years. It can delay it for years. It can delay it for a lifetime. It can delay it for lifetimes. And it is a very powerful thing that resistance is like a form of resistance. It is the core of resistance, but it's also a form that resistance takes, an ally that resistance recruits to stop you from pursuing your dreams. But that is another form of resistance that you can overcome despite how severe, so to speak, it may be. But once you overcome it, putting one foot, ahead of the other and going for it slowly and one step at a time, you start to see that fear maybe not completely go away, but you learn how to navigate and still move forward with the fear. It's like the fear is no longer driving the car. It's like now sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat, even better, or it's like completely out of the car. So that's even better. But fear is a big form of resistance. Another form that resistance can take, and I can vouch for this 100%, is healing. Resistance and healing. It's when you feel like you haven't healed enough. You're not healed enough. You haven't done enough self-improvement, on yourself. You're not healed enough to be able to pursue once I heal, once I take 5 years of therapy and read the 200 books on my list and do this and do that and, meditate for 5 years in a row, then I'll be healed and then I can then pursue my dreams. And there is truth to that. I'm not going to negate that. I think Steven Pressfield kind of takes a super hardcore approach. It's like, that the healing can always be a form of resistance, so to speak. It's like this, I'm not healed enough, I have to heal. But I do think there's truth to that to an extent where it's like, you don't want to completely not having faced your own shadow and your own issues before you're trying to out here kind of, whether it be helping others or doing something. Sometimes it is better to delay that and work on yourself. But to an extent, right? Because after a point, it can just become resistance where you're never healed enough. It's like, it's never enough healing. You always need to be more healed in order to pursue your dreams and goals and pursue that upward mobility. But that is definitely a form or an ally that resistance recruits. That healing is an ally that resistance recruits that can delay, again, your pursuit of your dreams and goals and aspirations for years and for a whole lifetime again. So that's another form. Let's talk about another form that resistance takes in our lives. Another form that resistance takes that I think is kind of similar to the healing is, and these are all, everything I'm talking about is just like, these are different little chapters in the work of art. It's like the different forms of resistance that Steven Pressfield has identified, and he basically describes each one a little bit, but I'm leaving some out. I'm just going over the ones that really stood out to me and have showed up in my life. This other one is called resistance and support. Basically, when you just constantly feel like, oh, I need like other people to support me in order for me to pursue my dreams, in order for me to go after my goals and my aspirations and my creative endeavors, like I need people's support. And the pursuit of any sort of self-improvement at the end of the day, I feel like is very, of course you can do it with people. You can have groups where you're supporting each other and you're growing together. But no one can grow for you. No one can do it for you. No one can start the business, lose the weight, start a YouTube channel, write the book. No one can create the art. No one can do it for you at the end of the day. You have to do it for yourself, And so, the need, the incessant need, the compulsive need for support is definitely a form of resistance. It's like, oh, well, I'll go after my goals and dreams once I have the support. Well, that's not always going to be the case. And you have to become aware of how that desire for support like that may be a resistance in your way. So that's another form that resistance can take. Lastly, the biggest form that Steven Pressfield thinks resistance takes is rationalization, is when we rationalize ourselves out of pursuing our dreams. It's like, it's like rationalization and resistance are almost like, they can be almost like synonymous to that degree. They are, entangled and intertwined with each other. Resistance and rationalization, the way it can show up is like you rationalize like, oh, I shouldn't do that because of the 1,000 reasons you come up with, and rationalize, oh, I shouldn't, pursue my dreams. I shouldn't go for it not now. 100,000 reasons that you come up with, and you can rationalize your way out of pursuing your dreams, pursuing your goals, aspiring for that upward mobility in your life. And rationalization is the last kind of form of resistance that Steven Pressfield identifies in the work of art, and it's probably the biggest one, and that's why he saved it for last. But he ends this book but after identifying all these different forms that resistance can take and talking about resistance, it ends it with saying, but resistance can be beaten. You can overcome resistance. Doesn't mean you beat it once and for all and it never comes back. He says, like, to this day, it shows up every day, but he knows how to beat it. And this is where the book 2 of the work of art comes into play, and the antidote to resistance. How can we overcome resistance in our lives? Part 2 or book 2 of the work of art talks about the antidote to resistance. How can we overcome resistance? And it's called turning pro. That is the antidote. That is the solution. What Steven Pressfield calls turning pro. And what does he mean by that? He talks about how most of us approach our creative endeavors, our self-improvement journey, our goals, dreams, aspiration, whatever, the upward mobility in our lives. We approach it as amateurs, and amateurs have certain qualities. He goes in detail about, what amateurs look like. It's like amateurs just show up when they feel like it. Amateurs just show up. They don't have patience, or they don't have certain attributes that, on the other hand, someone who is a professional does. And what he talks about, when he talks about professional, he starts talking about how, like, for example, someone like a surgeon who does like a professional job, any professional in their field, in the world, just not creative endeavors, right? But a professional, a pilot, a surgeon, they show up day in and day out. They show up when they don't feel like it. They show up because there is work to be done, and they are a professional. They will do it. They will do what is needed and is what is required of them. And a professional has a different attitude. A professional has a different mindset than the amateur. And in order to overcome resistance, we have to become professionals. He has an entire book called Turning Pro, all dedicated to becoming a professional, which is one of my favorite books of Steven Pressfield, actually. And the last line of that book has always been something that I've said, if I ever get a tattoo, it will probably be the last line of Turning Pro. But I'm not gonna say it here. I'll just, wait for you guys to read it as a little fun kind of find. I think you're gonna really enjoy that ending of that book. But nonetheless, Turning Pro is something that, I can, like just as he has devoted an entire book to it, I can devote a lot of time. But I'm just going to list some of the attributes that Steven Pressfield has identified in professionals, and basically the opposite of those would be the amateur. And we are trying to overcome the tendency of being an amateur in our own lives and turning pro. So what are some of the qualities of a professional? One of the first qualities of a professional is that a professional seeks order. Steven Pressfield talks about how an amateur, if you go to their workspace, their office, it's messy, it's not organized, and there is chaos around them, which consequently, and I'm not saying everyone's the same, I'm just talking about what's in the world of art, right? Some people may function well, but most of the time, a professional seeks order. They seek to have order around them in their workspace, in their work environment, so that that order, in a sense, translates and transfers into their mind and into their creative endeavor. Basically, a professional is not just there's no order in their life. There's no structure in their life. They have structure. They have order. They show up at certain times. They do, the work from certain time to certain time. They have order in their workspace. They have organization in their work environment. And they have order, whereas the amateur lacks order, lacks structure. And it's just kind of willy-nilly, kind of show up when they feel like, don't have schedule, don't have order. And it's kind of a chaotic situation. And as a result, it creates inconsistent results. Whereas a professional has order, has a certain structure that they adhere to. And it's different for everyone, but they have some sort of order in place that is repeatable. And it's like a system that repeats every day in and day out. Another quality of the professional is that the professional demystifies. And this is, oh my gosh, this is for me one of the biggest ones, because I am the opposite of someone who, it's like I take the simplest things and end up trying to mystify them. And that is something I have to always kind of fight against within myself. To a degree, it's good because I can think deeply about things and then come up with, new interesting ways to look at them, or different ways to explain them, and so on and so forth. But after a certain point, it becomes a complete form of resistance where you are just completely mystifying the creative process, even though it is mystical, at times. But the professional within us demystifies it. It's all right, I'm going to make a video, right? I'm just going to use this example. Well, I used to be all right, well, when, the video, it's such a spiritual thing. And when the spiritual inspiration comes in, then I show up, then I shoot the video. And it's kind of it'll just happen, kind of like that. Well, it never happened for 3-4 years that I had the desire for shooting videos. It never once happened when I was mystifying it. The moment I started demystifying the process and saying, all right, bro, at work, for example, at my job, it's demystified. It's I have a schedule. I'm going to, post this at this time. I'm going to create it on this day. I'm going to schedule it. I'm going to outline it. I'm going to, different things that I would use in my regular day-to-day, in my day job, the structures that are within that, the demystification of the process. I still do creative work in my day job and create different, creatives, but it's there is a demystification that happens in that, because you have a deadline, you have a certain number of pieces of content you have to produce, you have structure, you have a process of okay, I'm going to shoot on this day, I'm going to edit on this day, I'm going to outline, I'm going to, export, I'm going to do this. And there's a system in place, right? there's a demystification of the creative process that happens that an amateur lacks that demystification. It's all mystical. It's all, oh, the inspiration comes and it's like, and then it just flows out of me. And it's beautiful when that happens, because it does happen sometimes. But the demystification that the professional does actually increases the likelihood of that happens. And that's something we'll talk about in the last section of the video. But the professional demystifies the creative process. And that's something I personally struggle with, but something that I have tremendously benefited from understanding from this book, The War of Art. A professional acts in the face of fear. That's another quality of the professional. The professional doesn't mean that the professional never feels fear, but when the amateur runs away from fear and allows fear to be resistance and stop them, the professional moves forward. You know, it's like a warrior. And Steven Pressfield has written a lot of warrior books. He is obsessed with warrior culture. And another one of his amazing nonfiction books is called The Warrior Ethos, that can go really well and hand in hand with this book, The War of Art. Again, the War of Art. It's like very much a military terminology, and war and warrior mindset is very much embedded in the way Steven Pressfield thinks and approaches his works and the concepts in the War of Art. But the warrior is not someone who doesn't feel fear at all. The warrior is the one that feels the fear but pushes forward, still moves forward, still puts one foot in front of the other and marches forward in the face of fear and goes into the battle despite the fear. So that is another quality of the professional, or the warrior, you can say. A professional accepts no excuses. That's another quality of the professional. Whereas the amateur makes excuses all the time of like, oh, well, I didn't, that day I didn't feel like it. The other day this came up, the other day this, that, you know. And it's like, there's like 1,000 excuses as to why they didn't pursue their goal. They didn't go after their, you know, upward mobility, that aspiration that they have. They didn't pursue that. The professional doesn't accept those excuses. It's like, all right, well, it's like, imagine if like, you know, you're a pilot or someone who's like a professional at their job, a surgeon. If they constantly like make excuses, they are not going to remain in that professional role for long. Someone else is going to replace them who has that professional mindset. And it's like, we have to adopt that type of mindset in our own creative endeavors, in our own lives, in these creative aspirations that no one is, you know, standing over our head. We don't have a boss. We don't have someone that's holding us to that, like a job would, for example. But these are things that we have to install ourselves. We have to hold ourselves to these certain standards because there's nobody else doing that, you know, for us in most cases. And so as professionals, we do not accept excuses. And I'm not saying like go crazy. You know, I'm a lot more balanced, especially after having, you know, lived with the War of Art for 5-6 years now. But nonetheless, that is a chapter in the War of Art, that the professional accepts no excuses. Let's move on to the next attribute of the professional. Another quality of the professional is that the professional is prepared. The amateurs are unprepared. It's like, you know, the World Cup just recently kind of ended. And when I think about a professional like Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi, like, these people show up prepared, right? Like they've had, or an MMA fighter, right? Like they have weeks of camp. A person who just like plays soccer for fun, or a person who does, sometimes they like to have, you know, fight in a kind of martial arts gym or something, but like they do it every now and then and they just have, like, it's like a fun hobby for them. And they're an amateur, they're not as prepared. Whereas a professional fighter or a professional soccer player, they come in prepared, they have all their gear, they have all this different, you know, things that they need to perform at their best. They have weeks and months and years of preparation going into it, and they are always, you know, prepared for the battle, for what lays ahead. And that's how we need to be as artists, as creatives, as entrepreneurs, as people who are pursuing the upward mobility, growth-minded individuals, people who are trying to actualize a higher version of themselves. That's how we need to be. We need to be prepared just like a professional would be prepared. It's like, imagine if a surgeon showed up and was completely unprepared, you know, didn't have the tools, didn't have the anesthesia, didn't have what is needed. It's just like, that's like a nightmare situation for us if we're the patient of that surgeon, you know. So the professional is prepared, and that's another quality of the professional. Another quality of the professional is that the professional does not show off. You know, amateurs are very boasting and boastful. And I'm not saying all professionals don't do this, but like, for example, like Conor McGregor, you know, is a professional fighter, and is very much show-offy, so to speak. And then you have someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov, who does not show off. And I feel like in the course of time, it has been shown that like someone like that, the Khabib, the humble kind of guy, the one that doesn't show off and is not boastful, in the long term kind of beats out the other, even if they're professional, it beats out the other types of people, amateurs or professionals, who are boastful, who are show-offs. And it's just not a quality of the professional as Steven Pressfield sees it. So that's another quality. That's all I'll say about that. Let's move on to the next quality of the professional. I love this one. So the professional dedicates himself to mastering technique. What Steven Pressfield is talking about here is like, so a lot of us, especially when we're amateurs, right? We see the creative process as like, for example, let's say you're talking about, composing a song on the piano, a melody on the piano. An amateur may see it as this like, just like completely like mystical, you just get the inspiration and then like you just, go to the piano and then it just like flows out of you, right? But in order to actualize that, you have to actually have spent hours and hours and hours and possibly and definitely years of practice and mastering the technique, so that when the inspiration does come, you can be a clear channel for that. The skill is there. You have mastered your craft. You have mastered technique. Now, it doesn't mean you always are just so controlling and structured and restricted that you don't allow any room for inspiration. But because you have spent that time mastering technique, when this inspiration strikes, you have the ability to actually get the inspiration in your head and actualize it. And that's something I personally experienced with video making. When I first started, not that I'm like by any means like the greatest video maker or, even anywhere close, but just like having dedicated time to mastering and bettering my technique, now I can have an inspiration or an idea or have a vision for like what I want a certain frame or, video to look like, and be able to transfer that vision from just something in my head to an actual reality, a physicalized, kind of manifested version of that vision. And it's because I have spent the time mastering technique. And the more you master technique, like the better I get at video, the more I can more clearly, transfer this vision into what's on the screen. And I feel like a good example of this is James Cameron with the Avatar. I just recently watched the new Avatar movie like twice and just loved the movie. And I was just thinking how this person sees these images and how cool it is that they have the ability, they have mastered the technique. Not only them, but like the team surrounding them has mastered the techniques of CGI and all of these things that are involved in order to be able to like see the vision and then boom, like make it reality, like bring it into life. Like that is just incredible. And that has taken a professional such as James Cameron and the team involved mastering the technique and devoting hours and hours and hours and hours and years of their lives to mastering technique, so that when the inspiration comes, they're able to manifest it and realize it and actualize it. So mastering technique is another thing that the professional does. Another thing that the professional does that Steven Pressfield talks about is the professional does not take winning or losing personally. And Steven Pressfield really likes and loves, I think, the ideas in the book Bhagavad Gita, which is an essential spiritual text of the religion of Hinduism and all the different kind of sects, I guess you can call them, of Hinduism, such as the Bhakti kind of tradition and Vedanta, I believe it's called, or Vedanta. Basically these different forms of Hinduism per se. A big spiritual book, a main spiritual text in that religion is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita is a book that I feel like Steven Pressfield talks about a lot. He actually talks about it in the War of Art towards the end. But in the War of Art, a big mindset is that we are entitled, or we are entitled, I think that's the right word. We are entitled to the work, but not the fruit of the work. The labor, but not the fruits of the labor. So it's like show up, do the work to the best of your ability, and leave the fruits, leave what comes out of that to God, to the divine, to source, to life. It's like you just focus on doing the best work that you can do. We are basically attached, we are responsible for our labor, our work, but not the fruits of our labor. So the professional kind of has that mindset. It's like they don't take winning or losing personally. It's like they just do the best, they put their work out, and whether they win or lose, it's like it's not personal. It's like they are not attached to the fruits of that labor, but they do the labor to the best of their ability. So that's another quality of the professional. Another one is a professional reinvents himself or herself. A professional is always improving themselves, right? It's like they are not, again, the ego, because even at higher levels, like if you are aspiring from, going back to the very basic kind of foundation of this whole video, right? If you're aspiring to have upward mobility in your life and you're here and you're trying to go here, resistance, your ego is like here, basically believes you to be here at this level and you're trying to go to this higher level, right? Well, at some point, if you do overcome that resistance, that's what stands between these two levels, and you get here, well, now this level, this is now your new baseline. So like now you need to go from this step to here. So the ego now starts forming around this. Like this is the type of professional, or this is the type of artist I am. This is the type of entrepreneur I am. Like let's say you are trying to start a business, right? And you've never done it. And then you do like your first 100,000, K, your 100K in sales, your first 100K. And now like that has become your new identity, and the ego is like, oh, you're a 100K entrepreneur. Like you're not a millionaire, you're not a $1 million business owner, you're not a millionaire, multi-millionaire, you're not that, you're not a billionaire level, right? And the ego has now formed itself around your 100K. It's like it's limiting you, right? So now again, the resistance stands in the way of you breaking the habit of being yourself, you breaking the habits of the ego, the beliefs of the ego, and becoming your new higher version and moving forward towards that. So that's basically, I feel like what Steven Pressfield is talking about in this part, where the professional reinvents himself. The professional is not like, oh, well, I'm this type of artist, I'm this type of entrepreneur, and then stays there. No, they are constantly overcoming the resistance and moving kind of to new levels of their self-expression and their creative expression and their goals and their dreams and their aspirations. Last thing I'll talk about when it comes to being a professional is what Steven Pressfield has a chapter in the World of Art called You Inc. And You Inc. is basically talking about like you incorporated, like becoming, because a lot of times we are going after, I feel like all the time, right? These endeavors are personal, right? They are solo endeavors, so to speak. And You Inc. basically in this situation is talking about how like you have to see yourself. It's like you don't have a boss, right? You don't have someone, watching over you, keeping you accountable. It's like you don't have quotas, you don't have deadlines, you don't have this and that. It's like it's just you against you, right? And so you have to become your own boss. Basically, he talks about how the way you view this, the You Inc., the whole part that it talks about is you are employing you. You Inc., you incorporated, the business of you has an employee, one employee, it's you. How would you treat that employee? What standards would you hold that employee to? He's like, sometimes you just gotta like fire yourself, you know what I mean? It's like, he's talking about how like if you were in a job, right? Like if an employee did that, like you would fire them, so to speak. So basically you are in this business, the business You Inc., and it has one employee, it's you. So what standards, if you were a business, what standards would you hold that, person accountable to? What kind of quotas, deadlines, what structures would you have in place for them? You Inc., when you start seeing yourself as a company and you start thinking like that, you start holding yourself to a different standard. You start having more accountability to yourself. And it's just a good mindset to have, that a professional has that. It's like, there's another book, a short book called Managing Oneself. It's by an author called Peter Drucker, which is like a big kind of like OGs of the business management type of field of study. And in that short book, he's talking about how like basically in this current age that we are in, it's imperative. Whereas like people back in the days, like, most people used to work in a factory and their work wasn't creative work. They were, it's just like repetitive work. There was no, they had a boss, and that boss would like make sure that they, do their quotas, and that's it. But in this knowledge work age, we are our own bosses in a lot of ways. And we have to have that mindset of you, Inc. and manage ourselves, because in a lot of cases, no one's standing over our head managing us and deciding, oh, you got to do this now, this is what you need to do. At our job, we may have that, but in our own creative expression, in our own creative endeavors, in pursuing our own goals, we don't always have that. So we have to have that you, Inc. mindset and manage ourselves, because there's nobody else doing that, and become, it's just imperative. It's imperative that we have that skill set of managing ourselves, and having the mindset of you, Inc. helps with that, because now you're employing yourself. So you are your own employee. So treat that employee the way you would treat if you were literally hiring someone to do the work for you. So that is kind of the last section of the book 2, or the professional turning pro part of the War of Art that I'll talk about. And now let's go talk about the last part of the War of Art, which talks about the inspiration, the muse, etc. Okay, so book 3 of the War of Art is all about what Steven Pressfield calls the muse, or, in simpler terms, inspiration. An amateur is always waiting for inspiration. It's like they cannot work, especially if it's creative work. Like, they cannot do their creative work unless they have inspiration, right? Whereas the professional, and the way you approach the muse, and it's like, Steven Pressfield talks about how much as creatives we need the muse, we need the inspiration. But this idea that we cannot function without it is actually preventing us from experiencing more in our life. So the professional prepares the way for the muse by showing up consistently day in and day out, having a schedule, having a routine, having a structure. Then it's like, there's a story, I think, in the War of Art, either from Steven Pressfield himself, or like a quote or whatever, or something, his friend said to him. But basically, he's talking about like how this pro author, I think, he's talking about how it's funny how inspiration visits him every day. And funny enough, and I'm probably most likely butchering this, and it's funny enough, it always visits him at 8 o'clock sharp every single day, or 9 o'clock sharp, or whatever, it doesn't matter. At 9 o'clock sharp every single day. And what he's talking about that is basically like, this person has a structure, has a routine. They have demystified their creative process. As much as they would love the muse showing up, as much as they would appreciate inspiration flowing to them, they show up consistently. For example, in that story, it's like 9 a.m. every day. They show up, they sit at their work. And Steven Pressfield talks about how the muse, the gods, inspiration, God, it's like it sees that, and it's attracted to a person who is devoted to their work, who is dedicated to their work, who is disciplined, who shows up day in and day out, regardless of whether or not the muse shows up. And it wants to reward these type of people. And so it visits them more often. It's like the muse is more welcomed in an environment where such a person is, where a person is showing up day in and day out, and are consistent, and they are, with that action, with that devotion to their work, they are calling on the muse, and the muse appreciates that, and it goes to where it is appreciated. And so in order to attract inspiration, which is a very kind of mystical kind of thing, we have to do very unmystical type of stuff. And this is something it took me so long to kind of learn, but it's so, for someone like me, I cannot express this and emphasize this enough. Demystification and having things such as structured, schedule, routines, systems, these type of things that seem very non-mystical, these processes, they lead to very mystical results. And it's like, when you do that consistently, the consistent part is super huge. And I just talked about in my last video how it's imperative for us to pursue purpose consistently. and how, when we don't do it consistently being the key operative word here, it doesn't give the same kind of fruits. But nonetheless, the consistency and all these other unmystical type of stuff, such as processes, systems, routine, schedules, deadlines, your own like output, goals, and etc. These types of non-mystical stuff lead to, and doing them consistently, that being the keyword, lead to very, very mystical results. And the inspiration sees that. And it has happened in my life that many times where it's like the inspiration may not be there when I'm starting, but having the structure, having the system, and doing it consistently leads to the inspiration and the muse visiting me much, much, much more often. It's like the more of a channel you become, meaning that you get inspiration and you express that inspiration. Someone who is creating consistently is a person like that. The more you have openness, because it's like if you are not doing that consistently and you're showing up day in and day out and expressing those, like there's no more room left in your mind, in your being, for inspiration to show up. It's like it's all stuffed up, like there's no room left. And the more you start expressing that, it's like you're opening space, because it's not like all stuffed up and clogged up. It's now open, and inspiration now has room to flow to you and through you, and it comes out of you and expresses itself through your work. So the muse part, which again, every creative person, appreciates the inspiration, but the professional prepares the way for it by being consistent and showing up day in and day out. And I will here say, this is something I have understood. This may not necessarily be from the world of art, but inspiration is the vehicle or the channel through which our higher self expresses itself in the realm of time and space, so to speak. Now, what do I mean by that? Inspiration being like part of source, part of God, in its truest sense, part of inspiration, in spirit, that's the root word. In spirit comes from the spirit, comes from God, comes from something bigger than ourselves, something unseen, something mystical, so to speak. It is the channel through which that thing, which exists out of time and space, and is non-local, is infinite, expresses itself. So the non-physical, the unmanifest, becomes manifest in the realm of time and space. So it goes from timeless, limitless, infinite to expressed. Inspiration is like the channel between that. It's like the bridge between that. It's the way for that to express itself in the form of time and space and physicality. So I feel like all of us have encountered pieces of music, pieces of art, pieces of, movies, shows, that it's like something, it doesn't happen all the time, but something greater has, in a sense, it's like the person was just a vessel for that thing, for a channel for that expression. And it was bigger than them, but it expressed itself through them. So inspiration is a form for the higher self to express itself through us. And again, it's a beautiful thing when it happens, but the amateur may always just wait for that, right? But the professional shows up day in and day out, and by doing so, they prepare the way for that happening more often. And the cycle will happen more and more often. And also, when they dedicate themselves to mastering technique, as we talked about in the qualities of the professional, this phenomenon of the higher self being expressed through the medium and channel of inspiration more so into the world, this phenomenon happens more when we show up consistently, dedicate ourselves to mastering technique, and are a professional, and we become a vessel for these ideas it's like, where did that come from? It's like it's a mystery, so to speak, of where it came from, but it expresses itself through us. And it's a way for God, for lack of a better word, to, I'm not even going to say for lack of a better word, it's a way for God to show up through us into the world. And it's truly a gift, that we offer. And at that point, it's like what you create and give to the world, it truly feels like a gift. It's like, and it helps not being personally attached to it, because you deeply realize it came from something other than you. It came through you, but it wasn't of you. And yeah, it's just a fascinating, spiritual, beautiful, profound thing that happens that one can only experience, and words don't do it justice. But it is something that we can become channels to and become more privy to, and it can happen more often as we do this process of consistently showing up. And another book that's great on creativity is called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And in that book, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about how these ideas are like these entities, right? And she's talked about, and many artists have expressed this throughout the world, where at the same time, in two different parts of the world, two artists may come up with the same song. Two artists may come up with the same idea. Two entrepreneurs may come up with the same business. Two different places, completely, not talking to each other. Somehow, some way, they are connected to the same source. And Elizabeth Gilbert in Big Magic, one of the ideas that's always stuck with me is these ideas are there. They want to be created through people. They're looking for a host, for an artist, for an entrepreneur, for a person who is choosing to express something higher. They're looking for that conduit. It's who is going to be my channel? And the way I sometimes see it in my head is it's like if the world was a map, right? Which is a map of the world. And you just see these green lights pop up. And that's every willing person who is deciding to be a channel, a truly helpful person, and become a vessel for something greater than themselves to help others through them, to show up through them. These ideas find these hosts, and that's how and Elizabeth Gilbert, for example, talks about how there was a time where a certain idea for a certain book, certain story, kept coming to her, but she wasn't pursuing it. She didn't pursue it. It's it kept knocking, and she didn't answer fully. So she ended up writing the book. A friend of hers later wrote the same exact book. They never had talked about it, never communicated about this idea. She never had said anything about it. This friend of hers, who was another writer, wrote this exact book at the same time that the idea was trying to come to her. So it's this idea was hovering in ether, and was hey, Elizabeth, you have the skills, you have the qualities, I want to be expressed through you. And she was no. And how often, so many of us are turning a blind eye to our inspirations, it's we have these ideas that keep coming back to us, and we just turn a deaf ear, so to speak, to these ideas. And so they find another host. It's okay, they're gonna, this person, obviously I want to express through them, which will bring gifts to so many people through that, but also to that person themselves as a conduit for that. But it's they're not answering, they're not willing. So I'm just gonna go find another willing, conduit, host, so to speak, to express that and help people through that. So this happens, this visual, I think, is pretty cool to think about how these ideas, these inspirations, they want to be expressed through us, but we have to be willing conduits, and we have to show up consistently, be professionals, master our technique, and dedicate ourselves to the craft. But I have one addition that has helped me tremendously in invoking the muse, in initiating the process more, and that is an intention to be truly helpful. And this is something I got from A Course in Miracles, which is a spiritual book that I really enjoy. And A Course in Miracles talks about, there's a prayer in that it says, I am here only, starts with that, I am here only to be truly helpful. That's something I say before every workday. That's something I say before every video. That's something I say before everything. If I'm meeting someone, And I found that intention of wanting to be truly helpful, in a sense, you're saying, I want to be used to bring helpfulness to others. That intention in and of itself leads to inspiration in a lot of ways, in a lot of cases. I have seen it just, I don't know, lead to fruits that are beyond, my expectations. Like, they have just wowed me in many ways. But it all is because of that intention. So this is not in the Word of Art. This is my addition to it. But having the intention to be truly helpful, I think, leads to inspiration visiting us more, because the inspiration is wanting to help through us. So when we're like, hey, I want to be truly helpful, and the inspiration is like, well, me too, like, let's work together. It's like, sweet, like, I found my host, and it shows up more and more. So I think that's all I say about the Muse. The Muse book 3 part of the Word of Art is kind of like the more complicated part of the Word of Art. So I just kind of briefly talked about those understandings of what the Muse is and the inspiration. But to wrap it up, I'll just talk about a little bit of something that Steven Pressfield really likes to talk about, especially when he talks about the Muse, is that he really likes the Jungian, Carl Jung, understanding of like the psyche, and the ego being like the small dot, and then the self with the capital S being our spirit, being our true self. That is our like higher self that's like enveloping this, like our tiny little idea of who we think we are. And this self with the capital S, which is our spirit, is it's a part of us that's like completely you can say one with God, and still as God created it. That part of us is the source of inspiration. And this self, this ego, this tiny sense of self that we have, this self with this small s, is like, no, I'm little PJ, whatever, right? Like, I have this like little tiny identity of who I think I am. The self is like, no. You have forgotten who you are. You are way more than that. You may see yourself as this tiny speck, this like limited aspect of who you think you are, right? And you have all these ideas to support that. But the self sees you as way more capable. It sees you as whole, as limitless, as infinite, as limitless potential, as complete, as innocent, as loved, as pure, as holy, sinless, innocent, like complete, like all these things, all these attributes. It sees you as all of those. It sees you as your full potential, whereas you, as your little tiny self-identity ego, when you're operating purely from that, you don't see that. So the inspirations are a call from this higher self, the self with the capital S, to the small self of, hey, wake up, remember who you are. And little by little, because the whole structure of this ego is like, in a sense, it's like created to prevent you from remembering that bigger self. And having this like, false humility of like, yo, I'm just like this little self. The inspirations, as you give birth to them, through the evidence of them and through what comes through you, when you do that, off more and more, you give birth to these inspirations, you are showing yourself who you really are in truth. So your little ego identity is like, oh, like, I didn't think I can do that, but I showed myself I can. And it's becoming bigger and bigger. So slowly, this little dot, I guess should be pointing here. This little dot that you are, this little tiny dot that you thought you are, as it gives these inspirations, it's like, oh, like, I didn't think I can start a business, but I did. And now your identity starts becoming bigger. I didn't think I can lose the weight, but I did. I didn't think I can make the art, but I did. I didn't think I can make the money, but I did. I didn't think I can improve myself in that way, but I did. And boom, boom, boom. Like, you are realizing your infinite potential, and your small self is becoming one or more like the capital S. And I believe the people who we call ascended masters, such as Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, these people were people who their small self, Jesus, the person, for example, and this is, I feel like me and Steven Pressfield, if we had a conversation, I feel like we would see eye to eye on this. I may be expressing it a little bit differently from my own understandings spiritually that may be a little bit different than his, but I feel like we would completely agree. And especially if you listen to his podcast with Joe Rogan, he'll talk about his latest one. He talked about this kind of concepts. But it's like those people, those avatars, the Jesus, the man, was completely one with the capital S self version. Let's call it the Christ in this situation. To call it the Christ, that capital S self version of ourselves, the highest, absolute highest self version of ourselves. These avatars were their small self and their higher self was one. There was no discrepancy. It wasn't like, oh, there's like this. These people had become one. They had become a full. That's what they are called, avatars. They are an avatar for the highest consciousness and expression that a human being can take in this lifetime. It's like this ego has completely let go of all its stories and has become one with the truest self and essence of who we are. And so the avatars become the avatars of that truth, of the truth of who we are. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, I think, a good place to stop. This can go very deep, and it took me years of working with the concepts in the world of art to see the more, again, part of me is the fact that who I am is like, I love the mystical stuff. So 5-6 years of working with these concepts has shown me the deeper spiritual implications of the things taught in the world of art. And it goes way beyond like, oh, like overcome resistance and make art, like it's way deeper than that. But it starts there, and it keeps growing as you start working with these concepts. So thank you to Steven Pressfield for identifying this enemy of resistance, because it is a force. It is a very real force it is our ego's desire to stay the same and survive and not grow and not change. Thank you to Steven Pressfield for identifying that, and thank you for this book of his, The War of Art, which is a result of him overcoming his resistance and producing it and helping us with it. So thank you for that. Again, this is a book that has truly changed my life. My life before reading this book and after this book are two different. My unlived life, as Steven Pressfield talks about, has slowly become more and more my lived life. My actual, the untapped potential has become more and more potential that is actualized. And I appreciate and thank Steven Pressfield for that and for his contribution to humanity via this book and his other books, his nonfiction books. And I thank you for watching this video. I hope that it helps you. I hope that you find it helpful and genuinely valuable, and that you take away something with it that can truly change your life, just like this book, The War of Art, has changed mine. So thank you. Check out the book. I have an affiliate link. If you buy this book from that link on Amazon, it will support my channel a little bit. I'll get a little percentage. So if you want to check out the book, check that book out. I don't have a physical copy anymore, because every time I get one, I end up gifting it to a friend of, some of my friends. So it's like impossible for me to hold on to one, but I've listened to audiobook 1,000 times. So check it out. Every version of the book is great. Obviously the text, the audiobook, all of them are great. I love the new audiobook that Steven Pressfield reads himself. I just like when authors read their own books. It hits different, so to speak. So anyways, I hope that this video helps you. I hope that you take away something from it that genuinely helps you. And I hope to see you again on my channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Most definitely, please subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. I make videos about self-improvement, self-development, spirituality, and things as such. And so if you want to see more stuff like that and overcome your resistance, our resistance together, that was so cheesy. But if you want to join that mission and that journey, please subscribe so that we can stay in touch and grow, continuously and simultaneously together. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you guys in my next video and next time on my channel. Thank you, and until then, goodbye.